Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 148 and I'm the show's host, Kyle. Foreign Policy Focus is a podcast where I discuss current events related to foreign policy and international news and then get some analysis on those events. For those of you who enjoy the show, please take the time to share it. You can find the show at foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, thelibertarianinstitute.org, or on the Facebook page Libertarian Union. So I'm going to start this show talking about Operation Olive Branch. This is, of course, the Turkish government's newest invasion of Syria. What's been happening here is the United States has long been backing the Syrian Democratic Forces, or the SDF, and they've controlled a large portion of eastern Syria. The SDF is mainly comprised of the Syrian Kurdish militia, the YPG, along with controlling a large portion of eastern Syria, and this is, if you're looking at a map, mostly the part of Syria that's east of the Euphrates River, but they do control some area in northern Syria all the way till about the central area of Syria around the town of Manbij. They also have an enclave that's separated by some Syrian rebel forces known as the Euphrates Shield Forces, and these are the Syrian rebels most heavily backed by Turkey. And their territory is also split by the Syrian Arab Army. Those are Assad's forces. On the other side of the split from their territory, there exists an enclave known as Afrin. Turkey has long complained about the Kurdish forces being on the opposite side of the Euphrates River. And in fact, the reason the Free Syrian Army soldiers, the Syrian rebels, are called the Euphrates Shield Soldiers is that the first Turkish operation into Syria was called Operation Euphrates Shield, where their plan was to block the YPG and Kurdish forces from crossing over the Euphrates River, which they did, and then captured the town of Manbij. The YPG and the SDF have done all of this with United States support, both from very critical aerial support, giving weapons, training, and then having U.S. soldiers embedded with them. About 2,000 U.S. soldiers are with I believe probably all of them are with the SDF forces. Now, there are no U.S. forces helping the YPG in the Afrin enclave. Prior to the Turkish start of Operation Olive Branch, Russian soldiers were embedded with the YPG there, but there wasn't quite as strong as a relationship between the Russian government and the Syrian Kurds. So this has created quite the awkward problem for the United States, as Turkey is a NATO ally, and in fact we launched the mid-air refueling tankers that allow the United States bombers to stay in the air so long in Syria from the Incirlik Air Base in Turkey, where we also store, I think, about 50 nuclear warheads. And they are fighting the forces that the United States pretty much now solely bats in Syria. Up through the Obama term, the United States also bat the al-Nusra type Syrian rebel fighters. However, when Trump took over as president, he at least seemingly ended the CIA program where we were arming the other Syrian rebel groups, and now we were only arming the SDF Kurdish forces. So over the weekend, Turkey seems to have made little progress. There was an announcement that I guess they did capture a strategic point in Afrin, but they're still pretty far away from the city. They have pushed into Kurdish territory in several places. Depending on what source you look at, whether it's Turkish or Kurdish, the casualty numbers vary pretty heavily. I think Air Wars is supposed to put out a report by the end of the month on the civilian casualties. Right now, so far, the numbers I'm seeing are about 50, almost all caused by the Turkish side of the military invasion. And I'm guessing that's mostly in bombing and shelling campaigns. It looks like the Turkish-backed Syrian rebels are also fighting against the YPG there, and they're taking quite a few casualties as well. Turkey has continued to make threats, even though the push into Afrin, I don't think, is going quite as swiftly as planned. They're now threatening, saying that they're going to attack in Manbij and demanding that the U.S. soldiers withdraw from that area. The concern here, I guess, is that if the U.S. soldiers don't withdraw from this area and then Turkey attacks, and you're now looking at a place where there's, NATO forces fighting against each other or something like that, Turkey could use maybe the Euphrates Shield forces as a proxy to go and then fight against the Kurds, and so at least then you don't have actual Turkish troops shooting at actual American troops. All the same, I don't think the United States has given any indication that they're going to back off of Manbij, and last week when General Votel visited Raqqa, he seemed to have ensured the Kurds that the United States was staying there to defend them. Some other news coming out of Syria is that we have Assad threatening Israel, saying if Israel continues to attack Assad targets within Syria, then he's going to fire a missile at an Israeli airport. I don't know what Assad's capabilities are on following through with that threat or how serious he is about it. But Israel has carried out a lot of airstrikes against Assad targets in Syria over the course of the Syrian civil war, and has certainly hurt the Assad's forces' capabilities to fight against Al-Qaeda and ISIS and al-Nusra. Is whatever, small percentage of the actual, rebels were moderates and, actual, democratic reformers and not just Islamists. So that's definitely something to keep an eye on. Everybody's attention right now is mostly toward, their heads are turned towards what's going on with Operation Olive Branch, and rightfully so. I'm sure there's a lot of very interesting negotiations going on right now, and I'm guessing that the instability between the two U.S. allies in Turkey and the Syrian Kurds is giving Assad an opportunity to get some concessions from one side or the other. Maybe he cuts a deal with the Syrian Kurds that will reduce or force out a large percentage of the United States troops in the Kurdish-held areas. If that's something that the Kurds are even able to negotiate, maybe he gets them to, give up any semblance of, make public announcements against, independence and agree to, an Assad government in Syria in exchange for Assad protecting the Kurdish fighters from Turkey. From Turkey's perspective, they've held an Assad must-go position for a long time, and so maybe Assad can negotiate with Erdogan, allowing Turkey to push all the Kurds on the, eastern side of the Euphrates River in exchange for, recognition of Assad as the leader of Syria or something like that. Either way, it definitely seems to work against the stated U.S. policy and the stated U.S. goals in Syria, that is, to have a united Syria with Assad out of power. We got a lot of big news coming out of Afghanistan. The big one is Sunday morning, at least Sunday morning United States time, there was a suicide bombing in Afghanistan. I think a total of 100 people died. What it seems is that the Taliban are behind the attack, where somebody drove an ambulance into a crowded area in Kabul, detonated a large number of explosives, and killed, 100 people, and I think that number is still rising at the time of this recording. I think this bears some semblance to two other attacks I remember in the past year. Another one in Afghanistan where I believe they used a fuel tanker and detonated it and killed, well over 50 people. Maybe that was over 100 too. And then the 500 people that were killed in the bombing in Mogadishu, where somebody used a truck full of explosives to flatten a large area and kill a large number of people. I think unfortunately this is one of the things that the United States is going to be dealing with moving forward on counterinsurgency, is much more violent and much more aggressive insurgent groups having access to large number of explosives because of the extreme amount of weapons put into the Middle East by all sides of all the conflicts. And then the other problem with these attacks is just, at this point, what are you going to do to stop them? Are you going to prevent and slow down ambulances from entering crowded areas? Is that your solution to the problem? Because I think that's going to create a lot, if not more, backlash than the actual terror attacks. I mean, if, you're halting ambulances with dead kids in the back to check for explosives before those ambulances get too close to the hospital, well, then you're going to lose a lot of patients on the way to the hospital. And so there's just no good solution to these kind of problems. I just read a report today that the United States has the equivalent to 3 squadrons, I believe, of Reaper drones now in Afghanistan, and these aren't even the only drones the United States has in Afghanistan. I think this is important just because, these are the kind of drones that are hovering all day and they're constantly having drones over villages. I've talked in the past a lot about how this provokes PTSD and causes PTSD in children and just creates a situation of terror and drives a lot of people to joining the terrorist forces and creates a lot of sympathy for the insurgents. So looking at the current situation in Afghanistan, I mean, it's just looking really bad. There was the attack on the Kabul hotel a couple days ago that killed a few Americans. And, there's just a lot of attacks, even in the capital city at this point. And it's looking like the central government there that the U.S. has backed for the past 16 years is absolutely unable to control and stop the gains of the Taliban at this point. So one of the things I want to do with this show a little bit more is, find clips of what people are talking about either on Fox, CNN, or MSNBC and kind of look into those and see what they're talking about and what the truth is. And that kind of thing. So right now, for the first one, I got an interview with Stephanie Ruhle, who is interviewing retired Admiral General James Stavridies on an article or an editorial he wrote for Bloomberg on why the United States needs to, what a relationship should be with Israel and in the greater context of the Middle East. So I'm going to go ahead and play the first section of that interview for you right here, and then I will talk about it.
One of President Trump's first meetings in Davos will be with Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. For years, the U.S. and Israel have had a very close bond, but it is now the time to use this relationship, or the question is this the time to use this relationship to potentially reshape a very volatile Middle East? That is the premise of an op-ed column by retired Admiral James Stavridies. In a Bloomberg View piece, Stavridies lays out the ways he believes the United States can help Israel as Iran rises to a regional power. Well,
all right, so there's just her setting up the interview and kind of saying what it's going to be about. I think from the start, you could tell she obviously doesn't know a whole lot about what she's going to be talking about here. When she's saying up the question, she even, doesn't even realize, obviously the United States has been using the alliance with Israel to shape, Middle Eastern policy. I mean, at the very least since the 1990s, and if not moving back further than that, of course, Israel played a role in the first Gulf War, and even larger roles in the American intervention since. And so to pretend like the United States is suddenly going to start using or accessing this alliance to reshape the Middle East simply is untrue. Some of the borders that have actually changed hands in the Middle East since Israel has taken power have been Israeli borders, even encroaching on Palestinian territory or taking and occupying a large portion of Lebanon for a time, or continuing to hold on to the Golan Heights as they do now. It's simply, and it should be very obvious to any sort of honest, journalist that Israel has, not just been sitting in the Middle East the whole time. And so the premise and the way she sets up the interview just, it doesn't even make sense from the start. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and play the second clip here.
Just walk us through this, General. What's the premise?
Well, first of all, I was in Israel last week. I spoke with a number of both active and retired senior Israelis. They would tell you that there have been more changes in the last 2 years in the Middle East than since the 7th century when Islam split into Sunni and Shia.
But what does the change mean?
The change is the rise of Iran and the possibility of Israel partnering with the Sunni Arab states. They already partner, of course, with Jordan and with Egypt. But, Stephanie, how about with Saudi Arabia? How about with the Gulf states? 10 years ago would have been impossible. Today, because of the rise of Iran, that political alignment is becoming more and more possible.
All right, again, her question isn't anything in depth at all. It's just, what is the premise here? And he kind of brings up that now is the time for the United States to capitalize on the Israeli relationship. And the reason to do this is there's been more change in the Middle East in the last 2 years than any time since the 7th century when Islam split in between Sunni and Shia. Now, the first thing is this is just insane analysis. I mean, if you look at things like the 2003 Iraq War, where the United States changed the alliance of Saddam Hussein by ending him in the Iraqi state, the central government there is now loyal to Iran, the longtime enemy of the Iraqi state under Saddam Hussein. And so that was a huge change. I mean, that Iraq controls a large portion of the world's oil reserves. There was a lot of wealth that Saddam Hussein had collected and was being collected by the Iraqi state. Obviously, you had the Islamic Caliphate existing in the Middle East. And while, that happened, I guess the fall of that happened in the past 2 years. So the rise of that was certainly before the past 2 years. You have the creation of the Israeli state in 1947, and then, of course, the Iranian Revolution, the overthrow of Mossadegh, and then the Iranian Revolution. And so those are seemingly all more significant events than anything, going on in the past couple of years in the Mideast. And really, if you look at kind of what's going on now, most of these are just fallout and consequences from the 2003 Iraq War. And so that would obviously be the big event. But he says this is the big event because it's the rise of Iran. And so, what could you possibly mean in the past 2 years, the rise of Iran? If anything, Iran has not necessarily gained really any power in the past 2 years. Prior to 2015, Iran was, the main enemy or main ally of Assad in Syria. And since Assad has been much more heavily reliant on Russia than on Iran and Hezbollah. And so, if you're just looking at Iranian influence over the past 2 years, I don't think there's any evidence that it's on a huge amount of rise or anything. As I was saying before, it wasn't that Iran has gained power in an ally in Iraq in the past 2 years. It was in 2003 when Saddam Hussein was overthrown and the United States helped turn Baghdad into a majority Shia city, and giving them the capital city gave them control of the country. The Shia are allied with the Iranian state, and if you look at when, the caliphate rose of the Islamic State into territory in Iraq and Syria, it was Iran that supported both the Iraqi and the Syrian states with militias. And so, again, we have the expansive Iranian influence, not because Iran is an expansionist power, but because they were combating the Islamic State. Again, if you're looking at influence of Iran, a lot of that influence is spread over to the Lebanon and the Palestinian areas because of the treatment of Israel of these two countries. But all this is going on, prior to the year 2000 and even 9/11. And so to identify Iran's power as greatly increasing in the past 2 years doesn't really make sense. If you're referring to the past 2 years, I'm guessing that he may be cluing in on Yemen here a little bit. But even then, that war is nearly 3 years old. And so identifying the 2-year mark again just doesn't make sense. And also the Houthis are not like Hezbollah. The rebel group that are Shia in Yemen don't receive a lot of support from Iran, if any at all. Iran has given them some advice and they've ignored it every time. There doesn't seem to be a whole lot of Iranian advocacy for the Houthis on the international stage. Yemen is still being starved to death. There's no security resolution against Saudi Arabia or the Emiratis or anything like that. And so it's hard in any way to find that Iran's influence is really expanding in Yemen in any way, just because the Houthis are mainly fighting this war on their own. He says that this rise in Iranian power will create an alliance between Israel and the Sunni states, and then talks about Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and the Qataris and other states like that. And then, acknowledging that Jordan and Egypt were already allies. This has seemingly been going on for quite a while now, and I do think it in some ways has to do with the Iranian state, but I think it's more that the Iranian state, having negotiated a nuclear program, can move closer to the West. And Saudi Arabia and the UAE, looking to keep their dominant position as the satellite states of the United States, are looking to compromise on things with Israel. I don't think it's necessarily that Israel is making a whole lot of concessions here, but that Saudi Arabia and the UAE are just gonna, at least pretend to care a little less about what's going on in Israel with the Palestinians. Especially since it seems that the Palestinians' main backer and protector is Hezbollah, who is backed by Iran. And so they're okay with cutting the Palestinians loose in order to gain a little bit more of an alliance with Israel. Also, they've made common, enemies with each other, or Israel, I guess, has common enemy with Saudi Arabia and the UAE in Syria, where Hezbollah has worked to help Assad, opposed by all of those countries. And so I guess, again, and so with the Syria situation, you see how Israel and the UAE and Saudi Arabia have a common enemy. And so, like the Iran situation, maybe this is how they start to get a foothold and form that alliance. Now we'll move on to the next clip.
Then clearly the Iran nuclear deal is a focus for President Trump. I'd like to believe that President Trump is going to read your Bloomberg View piece. But let's say he's watching and he's going to be sitting down with Benjamin Netanyahu 2 days from now.
Sure.
What do you want them to discuss? What do you want to come out of this?
Top of the list is the danger of a rising Iran. And Iran has imperial ambitions. They still think of themselves as they did 2,000 years ago when it was the Persian Empire. So,
all right, and so the question she asks is, what do you want the United States, or what do you want Trump to talk to Netanyahu about? And this guy says, I want him to talk to Netanyahu about how dangerous Iran is. Now, first of all, the Israelis have been one of the, more Islamist countries on this group, so it's not like Trump is going to go to Netanyahu and explain the dangers of Iran. Netanyahu has been warning that, the Iranians are trying to get a secret nuclear bomb and have been talking about how terrible the nuclear deal is. And so this doesn't really make sense that this would be the talking point that you prescribe Trump to give Netanyahu. Although it just overall seems kind of like an odd question, because the diplomacy and what would go on here, creating this alliance or whatever would be much more behind the scenes and wouldn't unfold at this single meeting. But I think that's generally what she was trying to ask, is kind of what policy you would prescribe Trump to follow. He talks about, the fear of a rising Iran, and that Iran has, ambitions, imperial ambitions. Now, first of all, I find it really amazing that on MSNBC, a site where, I struggle to find content on foreign policy, but yet there's tons of stuff on equality, women's rights, LGBT rights, immigration stuff. And this guy gets away with saying that the Iranians haven't changed at all in 2,000 years. Of course, probably referring back, to the idea that, the ancient Persians were invading, Eastern Europe or something like that. And so, like I said, it's insane that he gets away with saying it like this, but it just kind of goes to show either how little they understand about foreign policy or how inconsistent their views are. And it's just, whenever it's an ally of the United States or something like that, then you could be offended. But if it's the evil, stupid enemies, like you could talk bad about the Russians or the Iranians, or the North Koreans, you could get away with that. But again, the idea that Iran is somehow a rising power and that this is a new threat is completely ridiculous. If anything, Iran should be less of a threat now just because they conceded and gave in and have now an extra safeguarded nuclear inspections agreement. So there's no way the Iranians could secretly be building nuclear weapons. But, this is obviously lost on this retired General Admiral.
U.S., Israel together oppose Iran. The question is, who are the other partners in the region? Adding Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states to that mix, not in an alliance, but working with us, sharing intelligence, conducting exercises, maritime interception, cyber cooperation, becomes a powerful way to help isolate Iran in the region.
So I guess here this is kind of interesting because he talks about Israel allying with the Gulf states. First, he doesn't mention the problem that, Saudi Arabia is blockading Yemen and Qatar. So of the 6 Gulf states, 2 of them are opposed to, 2 of the others, the Saudis and the Emiratis. And so it seems like this guy is missing, obviously, that this, alliance, which he says, is not going to be alliance, is going to be a lot, harder to put together than he just says, Benjamin Netanyahu, make it happen. Again, too, he leaves off Turkey, who would be a key ally in the Middle East, no matter what you want to do here. And, kind of leaves out that Saudi Arabia and Turkey, at least have opposing positions on some of the issues going on in the Middle East, including the Qatar crisis. And so, this guy is just saying, all these Gulf Arab states are going to work with Israel and this is going to be a counter to Iran. And of course, Iran's the biggest threat in the world ever right now. But, good luck getting all these countries to work along with each other and not just Israel. Also failing to mention here, the Jerusalem issue and that it may be too much for these countries to work with Israel. Also, he says it's not an alliance and then says they're going to do all these things together, which basically means it's an alliance. And so obviously he understands a lot of the problems with the policy he's prescribing, I think. Now we're going to get into the next clip.
And what does Israel want from the United States in relation to Iran?
In relation to Iran, they want a strong, activist United States who pushes back on Iran in Yemen, who pushes back in Syria, who pushes back in Iraq, who pushes back in Lebanon. All of these places we see the Iranian machine moving forward. Israel wants a partner that can stand with them against that rising Iranian threat.
So the next question she asks is, what does Israel want in relation to Iran? And he says, for the United States to counter Iran in Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Yemen. Never once anybody here asking if that's a good idea or if this is the right side of the conflict to be on, but just assuming that everything is. It really doesn't make much sense anyways. As I already pointed out, the 2003 war in Iraq was fought on behalf of Iran and gave the state control to them. Lebanon, Hezbollah, it exists, it's there. I'm not sure what, he's really expecting the United States to do to counter Hezbollah there. And that the main part of their existence was formed as a counter to Iran or Israeli occupation of Lebanon. In Syria, it was at least in part the United States, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatari, and Israeli support for the Syrian armed opposition that put Assad in such a desperate position that he needed Iranian and Hezbollah help and spread their influence in, Syria that way. And so, and then again in Yemen, the Iranians certainly aren't necessarily backing the Houthis, and it's not a situation like Iran and Hezbollah, but at the same time, the Houthis have only gained more power the more the United States and Saudi Arabia and the UAE has done in Yemen, excuse me. And so I think if you're being honest, though, and you're answering that question, and I don't think he really can be honest, what Israel wants is the United States to just go ahead and outright attack Iran for them. And this is because the Iranians support the main resistance to the Israeli occupation of the Palestinians. And if Israel wants to continue to take land from the Palestinians, Iran is going to be a barrier, or at least, a little bit of a roadblock in the course of that policy. Moving on to the next clip.
Benjamin Netanyahu is one world leader that the president seems to have a very good relationship with. Jared Kushner has known him since he was a child. Is the Trump administration's sort of broad-ranging backing or support of Israel, does that risk hurting our relationship with other allies?
I don't think it does. First of all, let's remember that Israel is in good shape with European countries. They have good relationships with both Egypt and Jordan, two of the major Sunni Arab states. They have good relationships throughout much of the rest of the world, other than the pushback they get, for example, over the Jerusalem as the capital issue. Those are tactical issues. I think strategically, Israel and the United States working together can create real positive security outcomes in the Middle East.
So right here in the follow-up, if we have, an honest and informed interviewer, would be, well, what about Turkey? Because Turkey seemed awfully upset with the United States over the move of the Jerusalem as recognizing it as the capital and moving the embassy there. And right now the United States and Turkey are on opposite sides. And so isn't this, hurting the relationship with the United States ally? Or point to the fact that Nikki Haley went on an absolute rampage and started complaining on the floor of the UN when a whole bunch of other countries voted to condemn the Israeli actions in stealing Palestinian land and imprisoning Palestinians. But none of those things are mentioned, and he pretty much just outright lies and says, no, it's not an issue. Everybody will just deal with Israel. Egypt and Jordan get along with them. Doesn't really mention that the dictatorships in both of those countries are propped up by the United States. There would have been a hostile, or at least more hostile government to Israel in Egypt with Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood. However, the United States didn't like that government and allowed al-Sisi to take over and now controls that country, and he's okay with the Israelis. And in fact, goes along with the Israeli blockade and, kind of containment of the people of Gaza. And I believe Sisi is now running in a one-man election, and so everybody's going to call him a democratically elected leader now, kind of like they did with Hadi in Yemen. Move on to the next clip. I think there's only 2 left.
Take a step back before we go. For the American who says, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Palestinians, why is that a priority for us? Why should I care? What is the argument to help Americans understand why it's essential?
I'll give you 3 in 10 seconds. One is Israel is our strongest ally in the most volatile region of the world. They are an anchor of democracy.
All right, and so now we get our last question, which is, why should we even go along with this policy? Why does it make sense for Americans to support Israel? Obviously, I think this is her trying to set up a question to counter the American first narrative. His response is, I'll give you 3 in 10 seconds. Of course, I think it takes him 10 seconds to get the first one, which you just heard there, but it's that, Israeli is the democracy and America's best ally in the Middle East. However, supporting Israel in the Middle East hasn't made Americans any safer. In fact, a lot of terrorists over the years that have targeted Americans, either the USS Cole, 9/11 hijackers, the bombings in Beirut, all dealt with the United States support for Israel was part of the reason that those terror attacks were carried out and those Americans were killed. And so it's not as obvious as this guy says on the face of it that supporting Israel is just in the benefit for Americans and that being their ally is a good thing. Israel commits a lot of human rights abuses, and one of those is by keeping the Palestinians without the ability to either have their own state or become voting members and citizens of the Israeli state. They're basically kind of in a no man's land area where they're ruled under the military occupation of the Israelis and have no say over any meaningful leadership within, either their country or the Israeli country. And to pretend, like he said, Israel is the best democracy in the Middle East simply isn't true. And if you're looking for a democracy in the Middle East, I mean, you have a hard time picking one. But at least in Iraq and Iran, a majority of the people are allowed to vote. I think the situation you have now in Turkey kind of suggests that that country is pretty far away from a democracy at this point as well. So now we're going to get into his second of 3 points he's going to make here in a lot more than 10 seconds.
Number 2, the cultural connections between this country and Israel are profound.
So point number 2 is that the cultural connections between Israel and the United States are profound. Again, this is MSNBC, not Fox News. So you would expect that this point would be countered by someone. She would go, wait a second here. You're saying we should just support the Israelis because they're the only other white people over there? But you don't get that at all. And, he just gets away with saying it. I don't think there's any real reason that, that would make us want to support the Israelis. And as I pointed out before, that alliance does create some security threats for the United States. And on to his final point and the, wrap up of the show here.
And number 3, strategically, we need their abilities in cyber, their defense industry, their innovativeness. They are a very real military partner. We ought to build on that relationship and make it stronger, Stephanie.
So when you hear him pause here, you kind of think it almost sounds like he's making it up as he goes. But basically he says that we need the Israeli defense. And I mean, I don't see any reason that, if the Israelis were producing weapons that the United States were in desperate needs of, we couldn't buy them without having a formal alliance, or we couldn't buy them somewhere else. Also, the Israelis buy an awful lot of American weapons. And I don't often hear people say, kind of the strategic military piece is the reason we need to have Israel there, meaning that we need their weapons. And the United States has the aircraft carriers there. We can park aircraft carriers in the Mediterranean. We have the base in Doha, Qatar. We station thousands of troops in Iraq and Syria. And so it doesn't necessarily make sense that, that would be the strategic reason that the United States must back Israel. Honestly, I don't think he has a good reason that the United States must back Israel. I think he could have made a much stronger case for himself. However, he completely failed to do so. And so if everybody likes kind of what I did here, breaking down that audio clip and talking about, what people are saying on the TV that people actually watch, I'm more than happy to continue to do that. If anybody wants to post a particular clip they have questions about in the Facebook group, Foreign Policy Focus, I'll certainly do that. I think it was fun, and I'm able to do it. So, if this is the kind of stuff you like, I'm more than happy to keep doing it. Please share the show, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, thelibertarianinstitute.org. Actually, libertarianinstitute.org, Facebook page, Libertarian Union, on Twitter at KYAAALE. I appreciate everybody, like I said, listening, sharing, and all that good stuff.